There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, be without food, but don't be without shelter or home. Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Kristen Clearfield, Associate Director at BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. We're pleased to launch today our new Housing Innovators event series, which will feature conversations with industry leaders, deploying cutting-edge strategies to address our nation's housing supply shortage and affordability crisis. In the months ahead, our series will explore how innovation across the housing industry can expand supply and lower costs for lower and middle-income families. Our inaugural session today features leaders in the rental industry who have developed and advanced new technologies to expand access to rental homes. We'll hear how they're reaching renters where they are, modernizing the search and leasing process, and bringing down housing costs. We'll also examine how the federal government can help foster innovation in the space. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by a fantastic panel of experts. First, we have Atticus LeBlanc, founder and chief executive officer of PadSplit, which is a co-living marketplace and affordable housing provider. Before founding PadSplit, he spent more than a decade as an affordable housing developer and contractor. Over the course of his career, Atticus has owned and managed more than 550 affordable rental units and over 200,000 square feet of commercial space. So thanks for being with us, Atticus. Next, we have Sifo Samela, founder and CEO of Matrix Rental Solutions, which is a tenant analysis fintech platform that uses AI to standardize the rental application process. Prior to launching Matrix, Sifo spent a decade in capital markets and later held key roles at hypergrowth fintech companies. He also held senior sales roles at Charles River Development and Bloomberg. And our third panelist is Elena Outlaw, Public Policy Manager at Zillow Group. At Zillow, Elena focuses on policy issues involving technology, housing finance, and real estate, with an emphasis on rental housing and housing supply. Before joining Zillow, she spent a decade working in local government and nonprofit organizations on policy development and advocacy across a range of issues. And thank you to our virtual audience for participating today as well. You can submit questions throughout the discussion by using the YouTube chat, and we'll leave time at the end of our event to respond to audience questions. So with that, let's get into the questions here. So first, each of your companies helps renters, including low and moderate income families, workers, participants in federal rental programs, access housing. So I'd love to hear from each of you about the segment of the rental population your company is seeking to serve, and then the needs that your company is aiming to meet for those renters. So I'll start with you, Elena. Zillow has introduced several tools recently, like portable applications, fee transparency for renters in recent years. How do these types of tools help in the rental search process, and which renters are you aiming to serve with those tools?
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Kristen. I'm glad to be in conversation with the three of you and everyone online who's joined us today. Most people are familiar with Zillow from the for sale side of our business. Who among us hasn't opened the app and daydreamed about a future home, or maybe you've looked at yours estimate, or even maybe your neighbor's estimate. What some people aren't fully aware of is that Zillow also operates the nation's most visited rental listings platform, with over 35 million monthly average unique visitors. With that rental platform, we seek to serve all housing providers and renters wherever they are in their housing journey. The common thread is that we seek to reduce friction, lower costs, and improve information gaps. So increase transparency in the rental market. For Zillow, consumers are our North Star, and we design and develop and improve our products with renters in mind, and an eye toward improving the consumer experience. So you mentioned some of the products that we have developed. I'll give just a little bit more detail about a few of them. Zillow has an online rental application that allows renters to apply one time for a flat fee of $35 and then use that application across all participating listings for 30 days. The average rental application fee is about $50 in the broader market. And most of our users apply at least twice with our application. So we know that that creates some necessary savings for folks. What we also know is that that savings that we generate through our application is even more pronounced for renters of color. Our research shows that Black and non-white Hispanic renters are more likely to report applying to at least 5 rentals. So you can see that that creates a significant amount of savings for those renters. Next, we're really proud of the work that we've done on the fee transparency side of things. We have a total monthly price experience that allows renters to understand what they'll pay for a rental. So base rent plus any monthly mandatory fees. And that obviously allows renters to understand what fits within their budget and allows them to save time in the rentals process. The last product tool that I'll talk about is our positive rent reporting tools. Zillow allows renters to sign up to have their positive rent payments, their on-time rent payments, made through Zillow's platform, reported to all 3 credit bureaus. What we have seen is that over 140,000 renters have chosen to have their on-time rent payments made through Zillow's platform reported. And we recently established a partnership with Isuzu, a tool called Credit Climb that allows renters who make payments outside of Zillow's platform to pay $20 annually to have those same positive rent payments reported to credit bureaus. Obviously, that's allowing renters to build their credit, which improves their ability to access housing and to hopefully make their way to home ownership one day if that's a goal that they have. So at Zillow, we're really proud to meet renters wherever they are and to provide tools that make finding a home easier.
Thank you so much, Elena. It really sounds like a good mix of improving the information that renters have access to about themselves and the market, and helping them, access homes they need and think about the future as well. CFO, I would love to hear a little bit more about Matrix. You founded the company to improve tenant screening. And so what problem or challenge were you trying to solve with that? And which renters are benefiting from your technology?
Great. Thanks for having me, Kristen. And honestly, big shout out to BPC. I mean, the work that's being done on the advocacy side to advocate for all Americans, not only in the homeownership market, but in rentals, truly is staggering. Matrix started with tenant screening, but the real problem we learned we were trying to solve was much bigger. The rental market was making high stakes housing decisions using tools that were built for a different economy. So we were denying housing, not because they couldn't pay, but because our systems couldn't understand how they were paid. Traditional screening used to overweight credit scoring and underweight things like verified income and assets, simply because the tools were not there. So people with the real ability to pay, voucher holders, hourly workers, caregivers, people with mixed or non-traditional income were getting left out by tools that weren't designed for today's workforce. What Matrix is a universal rental application. Think Common App and what it does for the undergrad admission space meets affordable housing. A single app, a single screening, but most importantly for consumers, a single fee. What Matrix has become is this infrastructure layer that's helping housing providers actually understand the financial reality across screening, income verification, as well as ongoing program assistance. The renters who benefit most are the ones who've always had the capability of sustaining housing, but were invisible to legacy systems.
Thank you for that, CFO. And we're surely going to dig into a little bit more of what your technology offers for renters. And so I'm excited to do that. But first, let's turn to Atticus. Atticus Pad Split is now operating in, I think, more than 30 cities. And so what gap in the housing market were you trying to fill with your shared housing model? And which renters are you seeing benefit from Pad Split?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, I mean, the Pad Split was really founded on the very basic question, which was, do the people who serve our communities deserve at least an opportunity to live in them? Think about anyone who works at an airport, minus the pilot, maybe that can't afford access to traditional housing. Anyone who works at a hotel, anyone who works at any local retail or grocery, any fast food employee, Uber driver, et cetera. And so it's really targeted as a technology platform serving the 50% of Americans who cannot afford their rent. And we do that by providing access to generally private rooms in shared homes for those individuals. And those homes are offered by third-party hosts, similar to Airbnb, but specifically dedicated towards affordability, where our average nightly rate is around $26 per night, if you were going to look at it like that. But they're fully furnished, all utilities included. We even provide access to telemedicine 24/7 for all of our residents as well. Right now, we served almost 75,000 residents. We have 30,000 units across 31 states at the moment, but really anyone anywhere in the country can list on Pad Split and provide access to these for these individuals. And we make the process very simple for them, where they can fully qualify within just a couple of minutes. Our median income is around $30,000 a year for the folks that we serve. And we end up saving those people over $300 every month relative to whatever option they were using before, which is equated over the course of our tenure as a company for over $200 million in savings for those individuals. We list those options on all sorts of different platforms, including Zillow. So thank you, Elena. And we try to fill those units as quickly as possible. So we provide the lead generation, getting rooms or apartments, in some cases, filled really, really quickly, on average less than 10 days to the time to refill one of those units. So much faster than what you would typically see in the market. We collect payments on a weekly or biweekly basis, which is really important for your traditional workers who are serving our communities, because it aligns with their paychecks. And then we handle all the stuff in between that really helps to build trust for those individuals. And the two problems that we're really trying to solve are both creating supply by taking advantage of the empty bedrooms, the millions of empty bedrooms that sit vacant in our country every single night, and then providing access by removing all the barriers to entry for workers that traditionally keep them out of housing, whether that's upfront deposits, minimum credit scores, long-term leases, and the like that really make it difficult for an American worker or retiree to be able to access those units. And so that's a quick highlight on who we are and what we do. And then the one other thing that I would just mention is by using these existing spaces, we've been able to save taxpayers over $8 billion compared to what those units would have cost under traditional affordable housing programs.
Thank you, Atticus. And thanks to Elena and Sifo as well. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation because I do think you're all working to reduce those barriers to entry to rental housing for your target renters. So I think the conversation will be a good one. I want to start out to talk a little bit about the growth of AI. As we talk about innovation in this space, I think we do need to address the rapid growth of AI and its impact on the rental housing industry. And Sifo, I've seen Matrix described in interviews as a tool to democratize rental access. And I know that your screening tool, at least, and maybe some of your other technologies in there, use AI to promote more equitable outcomes for renters than some of the more traditional screening methods. Can you talk about that? And then maybe what risks AI in general can pose to renters and how you are working to mitigate that?
Sure. AI is to technology today what blockchain was 10 years ago. Everyone talks about it, but what is it and how is it actually used? Here at Matrix, we're using AI, and I say that three different ways. The first is a workflow engine, really coordinating the Ford factory line of how a renter gets into housing. The second is as a layer of consistency. All too often, particularly in the voucher lease up process, there are these points of failure, but how are you able to create consistency? We're seeing it most often in the income calculation space. Might be the same document, but looked at three different ways and in three different timelines that creates three different results. And then last but not least, certainly not least, is it's a translator of messy documents into structured evidence. We look at the documents that go into the rental application process, bank statements, pay stubs, voucher documents, tax returns. All of these come in different types of formats and they're submitted at different cadences, but really being able to organize and digitize these documents is of the utmost importance. We're providing about a 400% return or ROI for the customers utilizing our platform. And we're finding that structured evidence has value, but so much of it gets buried inside pages upon pages of data. Our AI doesn't decide who gets housing. It decides how fast and how consistently those doing the work can accomplish the task. And so, I think when I think of risk, the overall risk with AI isn't automation, it's transparency. We design for explainability first, no eligibility decisions, no automated denials, human in the loop review, full audit trails. These are things that not only operators, but public housing authorities have as top of mind. And so when you're able to provide evidence-based outcomes, we find that the process moves much faster. Overall amounting to about a 50% reduction in turnaround time, just something that we'll get into as we go ahead. But really looking at the rental housing market as an ecosystem with a number of different players with the consumer in the center.
Thanks, Sifo. And that is a great segue. You mentioned outcomes, and I would love to talk about outcomes and how you really know whether a new technology or a new program that your company has built is successful. What does that mean? And so would turn it to Atticus, Elena, or Sifo to answer this. Within your company, how do you measure whether your innovation is working, whether it actually improves housing access or stability, and what metrics rise to the top for you?
I can take that, Kristen. It's a great question. I think there are probably a couple different ways to look at it. One, just taking access, for instance, and what are the alternative options that are available for someone in this income bracket. And so for us, we can underwrite folks on Social Security income without any public subsidy below $15,000 a year. And unfortunately, as I've realized over the course of my career in housing, more than 20 years, there simply aren't options available in many cases. There was just a big study in Atlanta talking about the number of families who were relegated to extended stay motels as their only housing option. We see thousands and thousands of instances where people are ultimately living in their cars in spite of having full-time employment. And I think that's just not really part of the national dialogue nearly to the degree that it should be. But by removing these barriers to entry, we know that just given the incomes that we can underwrite relative to any other traditional housing option, like an apartment or even a subsidized apartment that's available, that's maybe the first measure is to see essentially how can you create access for those individuals, but also take what is largely considered a subprime population and generate a behavior that is more equivalent and underwritable compared with like a Class A or Class B apartment complex. And so our average collections rate is another one of the KPIs that we track consistently, which has never dropped below 97.5%, in spite of the fact that we're talking about people generally with 500 credit scores or below that are often making well less than $30,000 a year, which surprises a lot of folks. But that's really on the access side. And then on the true outcomes, we want to make sure that we're providing housing as a vehicle for financial empowerment for these individuals. And while we measure tenure, and the average tenure is 9.5 months, and of course we want to see that be higher, we can also acknowledge that a lot of times someone in transition who maybe just went through a severe medical trauma or some other event in their lives, or 9% of our folks are moving directly out of unsheltered homelessness in spite of full-time employment. 3 months may be all that they need to stabilize themselves and get on to the next part of the housing continuum for them. In some cases, that is their own apartment. In some cases, it's buying a house. And so we really think of these as graduations, and those successes come in a lot of different forms. But at the end of the day, like, we want to know, will you refer or would you refer pad split to a friend? And right now that number for the last 3 years has been over 90% of our residents. And so that's probably the most important thing that we track.
That's great. Thank you for sharing some of those more interim outcomes and then sort of your ultimate goals there of success. Elena or Sifo, did you have anything to share on this?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here and just share that, one of the key indicators for us with the sort of number of tools that we provide to renters is, are consumers using the tools that we provide? And that shows us that we're bringing value to consumers. As Attica said, we're also interested in outcomes. So Zillow really seeks to improve access through products, partnerships, and policy. So we've touched on our products, but we also have partnerships with organizations like Housing Connector. And through that partnership, we've together worked to house over 10,000 people. So outcomes is a key indicator. Also, just our ability to provide tools is really important. And I want to just take a moment to shout out our economic research and consumer insights teams. They help us look at what our tools are doing, give us insights as to how we might evolve those tools, but also help us be in conversation with policymakers and other stakeholders in the rental market to understand what's happening, what pain points exist, how we can help fill gaps. And I would encourage everyone who's interested to visit Zillow.com/research to explore the wealth of publicly available data that Zillow does provide free of charge to consumers and policymakers and the general public.
Yeah, just to chime in as well, I think this is the importance of having everyone singing on the same platform. When we think about the consumer experience, we're seeing on average 3.1 rental applications per one consumer. Are we able to get that consumer into homes at a lower cost? On the landlord and the operator side, time to lease, we target a 50% reduction in turnaround for voucher products. But overall, the reduction in manual touch points on the housing choice voucher side, you're talking about a national average of about 36 business days to turn around. I think in mortgage terms, we call it clear to close. But on the housing choice voucher side, there are so many manual points and touches. And then for our public housing agency customers, we look at the reduction in the rework, reduction in error rates. By standardizing a process using automation, by the time a said package gets to a public housing agency operations office, it should be inclusive of everything that's needed. And that in turn reduces the number of reprocesses. Increasing landlord participation, that's a big one. We're in 11 states right now. When we go into the markets that we work with, being able to increase the incentive for landlord participation simply by just simplifying the process. And then faster recertifications and audits. I say that if a family is housed in 30 days, that's not an abstract benefit. That's a month less of instability. And so, we recently launched a partnership with the Connecticut Department of Housing where we were able to increase landlord participation by 24%. We were able to achieve those 50% reductions in turnaround time. But that ripple effect of the ecosystem is truly important because at the end of the day, consumers being housed, vouchers being utilized, it's the most important fact that we rely on. It's the fact that we have, great federal programs that are available like HCV, but if they are not able to be put into the hands of the individuals that are getting into the homes, that creates a bottleneck. And that's the friction that we're trying to reduce.
Absolutely. Thank you, all three of you. And I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, when we're talking about metrics in a housing program, we really are talking about people. And so it's really heartening to hear each of your approaches to that. Wonderful. So say we have figured out through our evaluation or metrics that our program is successful, that one of your tools are successful in a current market. We know that doesn't necessarily translate to every market in the country. Many housing innovations start out, they succeed in a few markets, but might struggle to scale up. So Atticus, I'll direct this to you, but Sifo and Alina, feel free to respond if you have any thoughts. From your perspective, what's the biggest constraint to scaling up? Is it, lack of capital, regulations in a certain place, or something else?
All of the above, I think, are certainly included, Kristen. But when we first started expanding to new markets, one of the core tenets of that expansion strategy was what we refer to internally as management strategy, and that's very simply the people who are closest to the problems are generally the best equipped to solve them. And our job as an organization, particularly as a technology organization, is to provide the information, services, and incentives that can help them solve those problems more effectively. And I think it's just the acknowledgement that every local jurisdiction has some problems that are very similar, but also unique to that specific jurisdiction. And so for us, we focus on the things that we can do better than anyone else, and specifically limit out the things that we just know that we can't. In some cases, I'll give an example for us, like in terms of landscaping or maintenance and repairs at a property. Those are going to be different if you have oil heat in the Northeast versus you're concerned about air conditioning in the tropics. And the MO that you put together to try to address those issues is going to be very different. And we don't really add any value in that part of the equation. So we focus specifically on the things that we can do better than anybody else, and that is massive demand generation. We will move in more than 4,000 people this month into rooms within 48 hours of their application. And regardless of where you are in the country, no one else can really do that effectively. To be able to process applications within a couple of minutes and get people moved in that quickly. No one else can really process the number of payments that we do on a monthly basis, where even if you have a house that's sharing, call it 6 rooms, and 6 rooms are rented individually, and that's really one house, you're talking about 25 plus payments per month if you're collecting on a weekly basis, not accounting for when someone has a flat tire or lost their job and needs to get an extension. That level of complexity is not something that really any landlord anywhere is equipped to handle. So that's something that we take on. We just crossed 1 million support tickets. And so like those are the types of things that we focus on that really translate across markets. But it doesn't really matter if you're in a single family home or a high rise. As different as those are and as localized as those particular architectures may be, there's still not anybody that's going to be able to produce the amount of demand as quickly to fill those units. And so it really just comes down to focusing on what are your core competencies and where can you really add value in the ecosystem.
Point, and something that I've definitely experienced on our side as well. With the idea that between local, state, and federal regulations, and just policy and structure, each one has a different complexity, and each market differs differently. We've seen that primarily in the tenant screening space. Which is why we created, call it a pun on words, but a matrix, a way of being able to determine based on a zip code how much information can a whole housing provider actually process and see. Think criminal history. Cook County, Illinois operates very differently than New York City, operates very differently than LA. And all of these are things that technology provides uplift. And so where we found success is, as opposed to digging in on the granular level at each local market, building products around feature function for product market, we focused on those core competencies as well. Reducing days to turnaround time is reducing days to turnaround time. It's something that positively impacts all three sides of the equation. Consumers are able to lease up faster, housing providers are able to put people into homes faster, and public housing authorities are able to reallocate resources faster. The thing you'll hear me say many times today is that ecosystemic effect. It's of the utmost importance, and it's something that transcends local, state, and federal.
And I'll just go ahead and reinforce that in a complex regulatory environment where there is a lot of inconsistency, that can create challenges that can be difficult to overcome. But that's something that we are constantly working through at Zillow. I would say, for instance, with our total price experience, there aren't requirements in every state to display total price. And so we could have an inconsistent consumer experience, but we have taken steps to make our tools available in every state, in every city, to ensure that consumers have the experience that they want to have to make renting easier, and to provide tools to housing providers even when it's not required by local regulation.
I don't want to miss this opportunity, though, Kristen, to point out that the minefield that are just regulations at a local level. In the event that there are any federal policymakers on the call, I think it would benefit not just everyone on this panel, but any houser across the country if we could get better uniformity and more common sense as it related to housing regulation. I'll just bring up Metro Atlanta, where I happen to be right now, where we have 83 different jurisdictions. And for those of you who don't know, the term family is defined on a local level. So that also means we have 83 different definitions of family, some of which still include the term domestic servant as inclusive of a family, right? And so we're talking about layers and layers of regulations that we're saying we want to create more housing supply, but very little effort on the grand scheme of things is being made to streamline some of those regulations, such as allowing the Golden Girls to live together under one roof, which is prohibited in most jurisdictions across America. And there are lots of ways that federal policy or state policy could streamline some of those issues.
Well, Atticus, you just segued perfectly into this next discussion topic, which is something that, at BPC, we like to dig into, that local, state, federal policy, if it's helping or hindering development. And with this conversation, really focusing on how the private sector is intersecting with these policies and regulations. As you mentioned, at the local level, zoning and land use really does directly shape how much rental housing communities can build, and what types of housing are allowed. And pad split, as you mentioned, also relies on shared housing, which some zoning laws prohibit. So how has zoning and land use regulations influenced where you can and cannot operate? And how have you attempted to overcome any of these regulatory obstacles, or have they been a real challenge?
We have overcome many of them in different states and cities. The short answer to your question, Kristen, unfortunately, is that we haven't had the capacity to be proactive lobbyists and we haven't had the time, frankly, to be able to wait for true regulatory reform, again, across 83 jurisdictions just in Metro Atlanta. And so we've tended to fight legally where those cases arise, and we've won those cases because, like, if you look at the Equal Protections Clause to the U.S. Constitution, or due process, or even just a lot of things under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there are federal protections in place that allow people to live in these homes. And so when we can get in front of a judge, we typically win. Unfortunately, it means that we have to get in front of a judge a decent amount. It's still only about 0.2% of all of our units. So it doesn't happen that frequently, but that's ultimately the way that we battle it. I would maybe ask the question a different way, though, which is what kind of system do we want, and what are the outcomes that we want? And do we believe that people who are working full time in cities across America should be able to afford a place to live that's respectable? Like, and if you just start there with, okay, well, yes, I hope everyone on the call agrees that someone who's working full time or who is full time retired should be able to have a safe, secure place to live that's respectable. Then you can back into what regulations are in the way that ultimately prevent that. And what has really infuriated me is if you look at the amount of space that we use, the amount of housing per person going back as far as 1950. In 1950, if you just take the total square footage of housing in the United States divided by the total population, you end up with 299 square feet per person. Well, today that number is almost 1,000 square feet per person. So everyone talks about the supply, quote unquote, shortage. It's not really a shortage, right? We have millions of empty bedrooms and orders of magnitude greater than what we perceive as the shortage. But these regulations largely prevent people from sleeping in empty bedrooms, which is absolutely crazy because it's far and away the fastest, most cost-effective way to be able to address the problem. And fortunately, though, we've seen some statewide preemption over the last 2 years, and we've got 5 states now that have said, look, all occupancy regulations should be based on health and safety. And it is as simple as that. And that any local jurisdiction who has laws on the books that prevent occupancy on something other than health and safety, or specifically blood relationship or domestic servitude, those are not allowed in this state. And really, there's not any reason why every state in America, I think, should not consider those types of regulations. And frankly, on a federal level, to be able to see the feds to say, look, we're spending a lot of money in transportation dollars, in housing dollars, CDBG funds, in these communities that ultimately make it harder to house people, and we shouldn't be spending those dollars.
I'll insert my hot take here. Regulation, we don't see that as necessarily the big problem. Regulation isn't the problem. The inconsistent implementation is the problem. We're finding that in rental housing, I could go on about, a $20 application cap in New York City versus uncapped fees in many other markets. But most housing programs don't fail because of bad policy. They fail because the operational burden makes participation so much more challenging. And, our constraint in rental housing, at least from the technology end, it hasn't been the zoning as much of like an administrative drag. It's even when the existing housing stock exists. How are we better utilizing existing housing? And when we look at powerful tools, powerful agents like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, we go into markets where FMR is right there, part and parcel with market rate. These should be natural matches. if you're able to more easily screen tenants and more easily evaluate ability to pay, we find that there's an opportunity, and it has nothing to do with the cost or the policy. It's simply a matter of matching and getting people into the homes faster. And so, the consistency of the product, the consistency of the implementation, we're finding in many markets across the country is actually quite solving the problem.
Real quick, CFO, just to segue from that, I posted something on LinkedIn recently. Aside from pad split, I'm also in the permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing world. And an application for one person, the file was this thick because, and you cannot get that person moved into housing. You cannot fill that unit until you have had a manager and caseworker go through and review everything in that packet, including birth certificate, tax returns, etc., to verify that this person is actually qualified or is homeless enough to move into that space. And that process can take months in many cases. And who are we really serving through this process? And the answer is no one. But there's a lot of opportunity to streamline that application flow if we know that, look, you can verify someone's identity right now literally within seconds. And a lot of those existing systems just need to catch up to where we are today.
Yeah, on one hand, I definitely want to save trees, so that in and of itself, I think, has a big part to play here. But everything you're saying is spot on. The process flow and what are we actually trying to achieve needs to be at heart. And I think you said earlier about common sense solutions, common sense approaches. That's something that we've found, through BPC. When we go and have these larger conversations, we find that let's start at the end result and let's back into what we need to do to get there. Income asset and identity verification is a perfect example of the applicability.
I think that's right, but I think we would all agree that there's not just one solution. If there were, we'd have wrapped this up a long time ago. Their supply is an issue, but making sure it's not just one kind of supply, that it's the supply that meets a variety of needs. So from the Zillow perspective, we are very invested in ensuring that what we call middle housing is being built. So not just single family, not just big multifamily housing, but duplexes, triplexes, ADUs, and the like. That is, again, there is no silver bullet, but we think that is a huge part of what needs to be done to ensure that there is enough housing supply. And we've seen this in a number of jurisdictions where there are fewer regulations or where regulations are applied in a smarter way and streamlined, more supply can be built and rents ease. Making access to housing easier for renters of all backgrounds.
Yeah, I love that. I love that point, Elena, and just thinking about needing to understand that housers create housing, and the more difficult that a regulation makes it for someone to create housing or operate that housing, the less likely they are to participate. And what we've seen, because we operate across the country, is some of these really, I'd say, high barrier markets. CFO, you brought up New York. It's not that we don't see a lot of our hosts who are from New York, or Los Angeles is maybe another kind of quintessential example. We have lots of hosts who live in LA and live in New York, and they don't invest in housing in LA and New York. And the question I think we should all be asking ourselves if we're regulators is why? Why would someone not invest in their own backyard? And if you can get the answer to that question, you'll find out pretty quickly how you can get more housing in those areas.
Well, thank you for that conversation. I did want to talk about one of the largest public-private partnerships in the country, which is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And I think several of you mentioned the difficulty of participating in a program and how that can discourage participation. And that's exactly what we're finding with the Housing Choice Voucher Program is landlords are citing challenges, administrative burdens that discourage participation. And CFO, I know you work with housing authorities and with voucher participants. So can you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing? What are the biggest barriers for landlords? And I think you might have touched on this already, but what are the policy problems, and then what are the process or the implementation problems, and how can we approach those?
Yeah, so Kristen, I think it's, truly breaking those into two separate buckets. Policy, what I call not the immovable, but the more difficult to move, and process, where there is always room for change. So, what is each? What is policy? I think payment standards, rent reasonableness, inspection rules. When I think process, however, I think about repeated document collection, manual income verification, slower inspections, inconsistent screening standards. These are things that definitely have room for change. And I think when you look at the overall challenge that we face with getting individuals into homes faster, particularly those in the housing choice voucher program, there's really no good reason why every voucher in the country should not go used. We look at some of the barriers for landlords, and it has to do with that. Atticus and Elena made the point about participation incentive. Those incentives are not always paper monetary. These are incentives around ease of connectivity, ease of experience. And, we look at some of the markets that we're operating in, the demand is there, and growing. Take Texas as an example. Texas renters are under immense pressure. A 9% population growth since COVID. It's more than twice the national average. And most recently, Texas A&M commissioned a study that showed that between rent growth and income volatility, there was a 5% growth in renters spending more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. And so when you think about the power of the housing choice voucher program truly being a proxy for that income, it's something that matches off very well with the return standards of investors, the return standards of the operators. It really is just connecting the process and connecting the dots. And so, the administrative delays are, worsening instability, but that's where the process matters. 60 to 90 days to lease a voucher household, that's not a housing shortage. That's just simply a systemic problem that we're working to fix. But, I've always said, landlords don't reject vouchers because of ideology. They reject because of the uncertainty.
It's a great point, Sifo. I mean, I will say though, Kristen, I think in my humble opinion, I'd say the Housing Choice Voucher Program is probably the most efficient government housing program that we have, at least in terms of aligning incentives. There are a lot of process issues, as Sifo has mentioned. I've been a Housing Choice Voucher landlord now for almost 20 years, and have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly over that time frame. For us at PadSplit, one of the things that's been frustrating is in 2020, there was guidance at a federal level that allowed shared housing voucher or vouchers to be used in shared housing. The problem is that for an SRO, you have a defined rent standard that's very easily to budget around, right? It's 75% of the 0-bedroom fair market rent, and that applies to any bedroom or any zip code in America. Whereas in shared housing, the way that it's created is pro rata based on the number of bedrooms in the home. And so the problem is it removes any incentive because I think it's probably clear for anyone on the call that shared housing is more work than just renting the entire unit. And if you can acknowledge that, yes, it's more work, and then you say your rent standard is pro rata based on the number of bedrooms in the home, there's absolutely zero incentive for a landlord to use a voucher in shared housing. Not to mention the fact that most public housing authorities, in spite of the federal guidance, don't have a shared housing policy in place at all. There's no department, they don't even offer it. And so I think we could house a lot of those people that Sifo mentioned very, very quickly if there were just common sense payment standards that were maybe based around this SRO standard as opposed to this different thing that's really unpredictable. And you could make sure that every public housing authority actually had a program to use these types of housing opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that's where the whole the saying "all politics is local" comes in. We're seeing great work being done locally and regionally around SROs and the utilization of subsidized housing, but we're seeing more of rapid rehousing vouchers being used in that case as opposed to this massive federally available program that should be easy to underwrite, easy to fill. So yeah, I mean, I think those are gaps that how can we get to a more nationalized standard But then again, I think that's where standardization matters. If you standardize the programs, if you standardize the intake, the speed of the inspections, making the payments predictable, the participation follows.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can underestimate the need to really educate both housing providers and renters about vouchers and how they can be used, and um, really to demystify a lot of the stigma around them that really does still exist, even though that we know that vouchers are a powerful tool for accessing housing. Zillow does some work to ensure that housing providers understand that vouchers are, and voucher users are just as good a renter as any other renter. And we really have done a lot of advocacy around ensuring source of income protections in jurisdictions around the country. And we've designed our tools to ensure that, for instance, voucher holders can input voucher data to be calculated as income as part of applications. And that's a small thing that really does make a big difference in ensuring that vouchers can be used when someone has them. Now, there are, as Atticus and SIPO have indicated, many fixes that need to be done with the program, but at a very high level, just that user education we think is really important for making voucher use more effective.
Yeah.
I think when we made the change from Section 8 to housing choice voucher, there absolutely needed to be a mass re-education that came alongside not just changing the program's name, but demystifying the stigmas that exist around it. We find even still, just reclassifying the terminology housing choice voucher absolutely changes directionally where the conversation's going. So it's hard work, but I think the work is being done out there right now, and it's companies like the three of ours, it's organizations like BPC that are helping to shepherd these conversations. But the work that's being done at the local level, we work with a fantastic SRO operator in Houston that is doing some amazing work with streamlining their processes, almost like Plinko as a game, moving the ball. They're seeing amazing turnaround rates, and although SROs in their case are being used for a variety of different lengths of stays, the fact that you can get a resident into a home within a very short period of time, that's definitely moving things in the right direction. So I would love to see some more work be done around using housing choice vouchers inside of those SROs to make the process that much more seamless, because the funding source is there, the demand is there, and again, the participation will follow.
I want to circle back here too, Kristen, to just the outcomes and being outcomes focused. In that, like we're talking a lot about the intricacies of the HCV program, but I mean, in the 1970s, they did a test on direct rental assistance that was just revisited, I believe, in the last couple of years by HUD and DPNR, and like the or PDNR, and saw that like there were significantly better outcomes with direct rental assistance than there were through a voucher type program. And so maybe re-envisioning the entire thing to say, well, if the goal is ultimately to get as many people housed as possible, to Elena's point, if that money shows up in someone's bank account and there's not necessarily a voucher, it's a lot easier for that person to get housing, and there's no question of discriminatory impacts of whether somebody has a voucher or somebody doesn't want to go through the process that CFO is alluding to because they just have money in their account. And I know for ourselves, we've done a number of experiments where we're giving 0% interest rent loans through a nonprofit partner to residents who have an income, like period, no questions asked. And we're seeing tenure increase on average 4 months. Well, $500 for 4 month increase in tenure is a no-brainer type of investment as you think about what they're ultimately paying in rent. And if you can solve someone's problem for a couple $100, why wouldn't we consider those options? Even with the potential increase in fraud risk or what have you, if that increase in fraud risk is de minimis compared to the overall impact and outcome, it's pretty easy calculation.
And I think, Atticus, that does get to the point of how do we create regulatory frameworks that allow that sort of experimentation? So from the Zillow perspective, like, are there pilots? Are there regulatory sandboxes that can be created so that we can try some of these things while maintaining consumer protections, but seeing if maybe doing things a little bit differently can get us to the outcomes that we want to see, acknowledging that there are many challenges with the programs that exist, and have existed for many years. So like, why not try something different and create the regulatory space to do that?
Yep. And I mean, Elena, no one is more better positioned than Zillow to start blending some of these products together. If you look at the 30-year fix as the greatest financial stability tool that we have in the housing market, right? Buy something, you have a 30-year mortgage, you can somewhat cadence out the largest payment that you'll make every single month, matching those against housing choice voucher payments and finding a way to stabilize rent using tools that we have at our availability aside from just the supply and demand of the housing market. I've heard some fantastic ideas, studies, think tanks around how are we utilizing everything in our toolkit, not just siloing each product and trying to solve bespoke problems. But I think that's the future in the innovation where many property technology companies are more forward thinking and going towards right now. So conversations like this, I think, are just the tip of the iceberg for some of the great innovation that's on the way.
Wonderful. This conversation has flown by, the hour has flown by, and I want to leave a moment or two for audience Q&A. So I am going to ask our panelists here one last question, and then we'll turn to the audience. And I want to talk about Congress. Both chambers have advanced bipartisan housing packages recently. The Senate's Road to Housing Act and the House's Housing for the 21st Century Act, which are aimed at improving housing affordability, removing some of those regulations we've talked about, and boosting supply ultimately. And so would love to hear, from the private sector, from your perspective, if there's one or two provisions in either of those packages that would benefit your work, if they can get to the finish line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So from Zillow's perspective, we think that more supply creates more access, more affordability. So we are thrilled that Congress is working on both of these proposals. I would be remiss if I didn't thank BPC for all of their work in getting these legislative packages together and helping move them forward. And Zillow is very excited to help move them forward during this Congress. In terms of specific provisions that we are supportive of, there are so many. I'll just call out a few. So anything that can incentivize easier permitting, and fewer zoning restrictions and land use restrictions at the state and local level those are things that Zillow absolutely gets behind. Also, any provisions that would help preserve existing housing stock, especially affordable housing stock, we think is a really important component of increasing housing supply and preserving housing supply. And then finally, efforts to convert commercial stock into residential housing, we think is really important, just given the volume of empty commercial space. So those are three proposals that we are excited to see included. And again, we are looking forward to partnering and seeing that work get done. And thank you to Congress and any members and staff who are on the call for your efforts to that end.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we were broadly supportive of both measures, and I think not that there's any direct benefit for our company through those measures, but broadly supportive of anything that increases supply. What I will say, I mean, for us, I mean, what I recognize is that you could ultimately create 7 million new units with less than 1% of existing housing stock in the U.S. today. And so I'd like to see maybe more there, whether it is around streamlining the housing choice voucher program and these payment standards for shared housing specifically, and taking advantage of those assets that we already have as a country, and or looking at forward income through FHA, Fannie, Freddie, for individual room rentals and treating room rentals the same way that they do accessory dwelling units right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited in what's coming down the pike right now. I mean, both road and housing for the 21st century, they both have provisions that are going to modernize our technology stack and standardize things. When I think about income and eligibility, when I think about document collection, these are all things that go into the process. What is considered acceptable? I'm very passionate about the fact that Congress is weighing in and then actually taking like a look at, what is the modern technology environment. We've been so focused on infrastructure. Most people think infrastructure as buildings, roads, and bridges. We think about infrastructure as the mobility of people, things that get people from point A to point B. And both bills include language that's assisting in that journey. The second part I would say is the inspections process. If you look at probably the things that hamstring participation more than anything, it's definitely that initial intake process, the standardization of the calculations, but most importantly, the inspections process. As we start to build out, more uniform framework, I think what we'll find is, enterprise consistency leads to operational efficiency, and both bills are doubling down, I think, in many words, to increase the use of technology and the overall acceptance and adoption. So, big thanks to those that have been continuing to push that forward. I know we've been very vocal for the last several months about that. But I do see light at the end of the tunnel. There's a lot of exciting things coming down.
Absolutely. Okay, I will ask one final question. 5 years from now, what would a renter-friendly housing system look like? This is for anyone.
I'll take that one. And picking up my crystal ball and looking into the future, 5 years from now, I think, is a place where renters don't need to reprove the same facts. We have access to such a greater stack of technology. I recently spoke to an executive director at a housing authority when we spoke about those that are on, fixed income benefits such as Social Security. The Social Security check is clearing the same way every month into the same bank account. Do we really need to go down the road of an annual recertification for that individual? Or are we able to simply use the technology that's broadly available to us to recertify that individual? I look at the future as a renter-friendly ecosystem is not one that lowers its standards. It's one that removes unnecessary friction. And if you look at the progress that we've made in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, there was this Pax Romana where all fintech and all prop tech was built for mortgage. What I'm proud to say is that I have seen over the last 5 years and for the foreseeable future, more of that technological investment coming towards the rental housing market, but more importantly, towards affordable housing.
I don't think you need to wait 5 years, Kristen. I mean, right now on Pad Split, like one $19 application gives you access to 30,000 units all across the country, and you don't have to sign any length of commitment. We have people who stay for months or people who stay for years and years, and can transfer for free from one unit to another as soon as they want, with all utilities included, fully furnished. And it really is kind of rentals as a service. We're starting to see more and more traction from individual apartments that are offering the same thing. And I think that's probably what eventually happens is the renters have that power of choice. And all of a sudden you have landlords that are really competing for those renters, regardless of what their income happens to be.
And I know we're pressing time, but I'll just say that we would want to see a market where there is just more housing types of all kinds, be that room for rent, ADUs, townhomes, et cetera, just more stock, which we know will bring down prices and make housing more accessible for more renters.
Well, a big thank you to Elena, Atticus, and CFO, and thank you to our virtual audience for joining us. We encourage you to go to bipartisanpolicy.org/subscribe to stay up to date on our work and to register for future sessions of our Housing Innovators series, including upcoming conversations on residential construction and access to homeownership. Thank you everyone very much again, and have a great day.